The Incredible Universe: The Top 10 Most Dangerous Serial Killers Ever. Ted Bundy was one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, and his crimes continue to shock and fascinate people to this day. Here are some more details about him. Modus operandi: Bundy's method of operation was to approach his victims in public places, posing as a trustworthy and helpful individual. He would then lure them into his car and transport them to a remote location where he would assault and kill them. He was known for being very cunning and manipulative, and his crimes often involved a high degree of violence. Criminal investigation and capture: Bundy's killing spree lasted for several years, and law enforcement agencies across several states were involved in the investigation. He was finally captured in February 1978 in Florida, where he was pulled over by a police officer for a minor traffic violation and was subsequently arrested when the officer discovered burglary tools in his car. He was eventually convicted of 3 murders in Florida and was sentenced to death. He later confessed to many other crimes and was linked to at least 30 murders across 7 states. Trial and appeals: Bundy's trial in Florida received widespread media coverage and was seen as a high-profile event. He represented himself in court and was known for his courtroom antics and attempts to delay his own execution. Despite his efforts, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. He was eventually executed by electric chair on January 24, 1989. Psychological profile: After his capture, several psychologists and criminologists attempted to profile Ted Bundy's motivations and personality. Many experts believe that he suffered from psychopathy and narcissistic personality disorder, which contributed to his disregard for the rights and lives of others. Some experts also believe that he had a deep-seated hatred of women and that his crimes were motivated by a twisted desire for power and control. Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, was an American serial killer who committed 17 murders in Wisconsin between 1978 and 1991. He is considered one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, and his crimes continue to shock and fascinate people to this day. Here are some more details about him. Modus operandi: Dahmer's method of operation was to lure young men and boys, often of African American or Asian descent, to his apartment, where he would drug and then kill them. He was known for performing horrific acts of necrophilia and cannibalism on his victims, and for attempting to turn some of them into zombies by drilling holes in their skulls and injecting acid into their brains. Criminal investigation and capture: Dahmer's killing spree lasted for over a decade, and law enforcement agencies in Milwaukee were aware of his crimes but failed to connect the dots. He was finally caught in July 1991, when one of his intended victims managed to escape from his apartment and alerted the police. When they searched his apartment, they discovered evidence of his horrific crimes, including human remains. Trial and sentence: Dahmer was charged with 15 counts of murder and was put on trial in Milwaukee in 1992. He eventually pleaded guilty but insane and was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, equivalent to a total of 957 years in prison. Psychological profile: After his capture, psychologists and criminologists attempted to profile Jeffrey Dahmer's motivations and personality. Many experts believe that he suffered from a variety of mental health conditions, including psychopathy and borderline personality disorder, which contributed to his disregard for the rights and lives of others. Some experts also believe that he had a deep-seated desire to control and dominate others, which was reflected in his horrific crimes. Dennis Rader, also known as the BTK Killer, bind, torture, kill, was an American serial killer who committed 10 murders in Kansas between 1974 and 1991. He is considered one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, and his crimes continue to shock and fascinate people to this day. Here are some more details about him. Modus operandi: Rader's method of operation was to stalk and attack families in their homes, often at night. He would bind, torture, and kill his victims, sometimes leaving taunting messages for the authorities. He was known for his elaborate planning and for taking souvenirs from his victims, such as driver's licenses and jewelry. Criminal investigation and capture: Rader's killing spree lasted for over 3 decades, and law enforcement agencies in Kansas struggled to catch him. He was finally caught in 2005, after he resumed sending taunting letters to the authorities and the media, and DNA evidence linked him to the crimes. Trial and sentence. Rader was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder and was put on trial in Kansas in 2005. He eventually pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms, equivalent to a total of 175 years in prison. Psychological profile. After his capture, psychologists and criminologists attempted to profile Dennis Rader's motivations and personality. Many experts believe that he suffered from psychopathy and narcissistic personality disorder, which contributed to his disregard for the rights and lives of others. Some experts also believe that he had a deep-seated desire for attention and power, which was reflected in his elaborate killings and taunting messages to the authorities. Aileen Wuornos was an American serial killer who committed 7 murders in Florida between 1989 and 1990. She is considered one of the few female serial killers in American history, and her story continues to attract widespread attention and interest. Here are some more details about her. Background. Wuornos was born in 1956 in Michigan and had a troubled childhood. She was abandoned by her mother and raised by her grandparents, and later became involved in a life of crime and prostitution. She eventually moved to Florida, where she committed her crimes. Modus operandi. Wuornos killed 7 men between 1989 and 1990, all of whom she claimed were trying to rape or assault her. She claimed that the killings were acts of self-defense, and that she had been forced to shoot each man in order to protect herself. Criminal investigation and capture. Wuornos was caught in 1991, after she was linked to the killings through physical evidence and eyewitness testimony. She was put on trial in Florida and was eventually convicted of 6 of the 7 murders. Trial and sentence. Wuornos was put on trial in Florida in 1992 and was eventually found guilty of 6 of the 7 murders. She was sentenced to death and was executed by lethal injection in 2002. Psychological profile. After her capture, psychologists and criminologists attempted to profile Aileen Wuornos's motivations and personality. Many experts believe that she suffered from a variety of mental health conditions, including borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, which contributed to her violent behavior. Some experts also believe that her background of abuse, trauma, and abandonment may have played a role in her crimes. Edmund Kemper, also known as the Co-Ed Killer, was an American serial killer who committed 10 murders in California between 1964 and 1973. He is considered one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, and his crimes continue to shock and fascinate people to this day. Here are some more details about him. Background. Kemper was born in 1948 in California and had a troubled childhood. He was diagnosed with a high IQ, but suffered from social and behavioral problems, and was eventually sent to live with his grandparents. As a teenager, he committed his first murders, killing his grandparents and then turning himself in. Modus operandi. Kemper targeted young women, many of whom were college students, and killed them in a variety of ways, including strangling, shooting, and stabbing. He also killed several of his own family members, including his mother. Criminal investigation and capture. Kemper was eventually caught in 1973, after being stopped for a minor traffic violation. He was linked to the murders through physical evidence and eventually confessed to all 10 of them. Trial and sentence. Kemper was put on trial in California in 1973 and was eventually found guilty of 10 counts of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Psychological profile. After his capture, psychologists and criminologists attempted to profile Ed Kemper's motivations and personality. Many experts believe that he suffered from a variety of mental health conditions, including psychopathy and sociopathy, which contributed to his disregard for the rights and lives of others. Some experts also believe that he had a deep-seated hatred of women, stemming from his troubled childhood and experiences with abandonment and rejection. John Wayne Gacy, also known as the Killer Clown, was an American serial killer who committed at least 33 murders in Illinois between 1972 and 1978. He is considered one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, and his crimes continue to shock and disgust people to this day. Background: Gacy was born in 1942 in Chicago and had a troubled childhood. He was diagnosed with a heart condition at a young age and struggled with his weight, and was frequently bullied by his peers. Despite this, he went on to build a successful career as a contractor and was involved in various community organizations. Modus operandi: Gacy targeted young men and boys, many of whom were hired as laborers or approached while hitchhiking, and lured him to his home where he would drug, strangle, and bury them in the crawl space of his home. Criminal investigation and capture: Gacy was eventually caught in 1978, after one of his employees disappeared and his house was searched. Physical evidence and eyewitness testimony linked him to the murders, and he eventually confessed to 33 counts of murder. Trial and sentence: Gacy was put on trial in Illinois in 1980 and was eventually found guilty of 33 counts of murder. He was sentenced to death and was executed by lethal injection in 1994. Psychological profile: after his capture, psychologists and criminologists attempted to profile John Wayne Gacy's motivations and personality. Many experts believe that he suffered from a variety of mental health conditions, including psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder, which contributed to his disregard for the rights and lives of others. Some experts also believe that he had a deep-seated hatred of homosexuals, stemming from his own repressed homosexual tendencies and experiences with abuse and rejection. Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker, was an American serial killer who committed at least 14 murders in California between 1984 and 1985. He is considered one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, and his crimes continue to shock and disgust people to this day. Here are some more details about him. Background: Ramirez was born in El Paso, Texas in 1960 and had a troubled childhood. He was diagnosed with epilepsy at a young age and was exposed to violence and abuse as a child. He also became involved with drugs and began to experience hallucinations. Modus operandi: Ramirez targeted both men and women, often breaking into their homes at night while they were sleeping. He would sexually assault and torture his victims, and often killed them in brutal ways. His attacks spread fear throughout Southern California, and he became known as the Night Stalker. Criminal investigation and capture: Ramirez was eventually caught in 1985, after being recognized by witnesses and attempting to steal a car. He was linked to the murders through physical evidence and was eventually identified by a fingerprint match. Trial and sentence: Ramirez was put on trial in California in 1989 and was eventually found guilty of 13 counts of murder, along with numerous other charges related to assault and burglary. He was sentenced to death and died in prison in 2013 while awaiting execution. Psychological profile: after his capture, psychologists and criminologists attempted to profile Richard Ramirez's motivations and personality. Many experts believe that he suffered from a variety of mental health conditions, including psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder, which contributed to his disregard for the rights and lives of others. Some experts also believe that he was influenced by Satanism and had a deep-seated hatred of women, stemming from his own experiences with abuse and rejection. Charles Manson was an American criminal and cult leader who was convicted of 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder in 1971. Despite not physically committing the murders himself, Manson was seen as the mastermind behind a series of 9 brutal killings that took place in California in the late 1960s. Background: Manson was born in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1934 and had a troubled childhood. He was in and out of reform schools and prisons throughout his teenage years and eventually ended up on the streets as a young adult. He became involved with drugs and began to assemble a group of followers, many of whom were young, vulnerable women. The Manson family: Manson formed a cult known as the Manson family, which was centered around his charismatic personality and ideology. He convinced his followers that he was a messiah figure and that they needed to carry out a series of violent acts in order to trigger the race war. The Tate LaBianca murders. In 1969, Manson ordered several members of the Manson family to carry out a series of brutal murders in the Los Angeles area. Trial and sentence. Manson was put on trial in California in 1970 and was eventually found guilty of 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. He was sentenced to death, but his sentence was later commuted to life in prison after the California Supreme Court temporarily abolished the death penalty. Legacy. Charles Manson's legacy as a criminal and cult leader continues to fascinate and repulse people to this day. He was often portrayed as a charismatic and manipulative individual who was able to convince others to carry out horrific acts of violence. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.